Pickup trucks are supposed to look tough and serious, but these went in a completely different direction. Strange designs, awkward proportions, bizarre engineering, and ideas that made people laugh the moment they saw them. Some looked like cartoons, others barely looked like trucks at all. These are the 7 world's most goofy pickup trucks you have to see to believe. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and thanks for watching. The Honda City Turbo 2 and the tiny Honda Moto Combo may be one of the strangest transportation combinations ever officially sold by a major manufacturer. Built by Honda during the wild creativity of 1980s Japan, the entire concept feels less like normal automotive engineering and more like somebody dared Honda engineers to turn a cartoon idea into reality. And somehow, they actually did it. At first glance, the City Turbo 2 already looks unusual enough on its own. It is tiny, boxy, upright, and packed with exaggerated styling details that make it feel playful rather than serious. The proportions are almost comically compact, especially compared to larger performance cars of the era. But then you open the rear cargo area and discover the real surprise. A fully designed folding scooter stored inside like luggage. Not as an aftermarket gimmick, not as a concept demonstration, an actual production vehicle pairing. The Honda Moto Combo was engineered specifically to fit into the back of the City like a perfectly shaped mechanical puzzle piece. Handlebars folded, seat collapsed, dimensions compressed, it transformed from transportation into cargo almost instantly. One owner joked, it looked like the car gave birth to another smaller car. That absurdity is exactly what makes the duo unforgettable, because the entire system reflects a very Japanese urban design philosophy of the early 1980s. Compact mobility stacked on top of even more compact mobility. The idea was surprisingly practical in theory. You drive the City Turbo 2 through urban traffic, park it outside crowded areas, then unfold the Moto Combo and continue navigating narrow streets or dense city zones on the tiny scooter. But emotionally, practicality is almost secondary, because visually, the entire setup looks hilarious. The City Turbo 2 already resembles a toy-sized performance hatchback with exaggerated turbo styling, and the Moto Combo looks like a piece of futuristic portable luggage that accidentally gained wheels. Together, they create an image that feels halfway between industrial design experiment and anime prop. One collector described it perfectly. It doesn't look real even when you're standing next to it. And honestly, that reaction is common. People seeing the pair together for the first time often assume one of them must be custom-built or fictional. The idea that a major manufacturer seriously engineered a tiny folding motorcycle to fit perfectly inside a tiny turbo hatchback sounds almost too bizarre to believe. But Honda was absolutely serious about it. The engineering behind the Moto Combo itself is surprisingly clever. The scooter was designed around portability above all else. Flat surfaces, folding controls, compact packaging, and minimal external protrusions allowed it to slot into the rear compartment with remarkable efficiency. When folded, it almost stops looking like a motorcycle entirely. It becomes an object, a machine compressed into geometric simplicity. Meanwhile, the Honda City Turbo 2 was not just a gimmick platform either. The turbocharged engine gave the lightweight hatchback a surprisingly energetic personality for its size. It was playful, agile, and intentionally youthful in character. The entire vehicle felt built around fun rather than seriousness. And that is important, because this was not a rugged utility system or hardcore engineering exercise. It was joy. Pure experimental joy. One driver summed it up perfectly. Every part of it feels like Honda engineers were laughing while designing it. That feeling radiates through the entire project. The car is small, the scooter is smaller, the styling is exaggerated. The concept is almost absurdly ambitious for such tiny machines. And yet, everything works together with surprising elegance. Of course, there were compromises. The Moto Combo was not fast, especially by motorcycle standards. The City itself remained compact and limited in cargo space once the scooter was removed. Long-distance comfort was secondary to urban maneuverability. But none of that really mattered to the people who loved these vehicles. Because nobody bought this combination purely for efficiency. They bought it because nothing else in the world looked or behaved remotely like it. Crowds gathered around them. People laughed, stared, asked questions, and watched the scooter unfold in disbelief. It turned ordinary parking lots into demonstrations of futuristic imagination. One owner remembered, showing people the scooter was more fun than driving the car. That says everything. Today, surviving City Turbo 2 and Motocompo pairs are highly collectible, partly because the concept feels impossible in the modern automotive world. Manufacturers today prioritize efficiency, safety regulations, and market predictability. But in the 1980s, especially in Japan's booming experimental design era, companies sometimes created machines simply because they could. And the result was magical. Not practical magic, not logical magic, but the kind of strange, caffeine-fueled engineering creativity that produces something so weird and charming that decades later people still stare at it and wonder how a major company ever convinced itself to build something so gloriously unnecessary. The Ford Ecoline pickup may be one of the strangest-looking utility vehicles America ever put into mass production. Built by Ford during the 1960s compact vehicle boom, it looked less like a traditional pickup and more like somebody took a delivery van, removed part of the roof, added a cargo bed, and then compressed the entire front end with industrial machinery. At first glance, the proportions almost seem wrong. The nose is nearly flat, the windshield feels too far forward, and the driver appears to be sitting where the engine bay should normally exist. That is because the Ecoline used a forward control layout, placing the cabin almost directly above the front axle. Instead of sitting behind a long hood like in most pickups, drivers sat frighteningly close to the front edge of the vehicle itself. One owner described the experience perfectly. You don't feel inside traffic, you feel part of it. And that sensation changes everything about the driving experience. The moment you sit behind the wheel of the Ford Ecoline pickup, your perspective feels unusual. The road stretches downward almost immediately beneath the windshield, and the front wheels feel physically connected to your feet. Steering inputs feel direct and immediate because there is very little vehicle extending ahead of you. At low speeds, that layout actually makes the truck surprisingly maneuverable. Parking becomes easy because you can judge the front edge with incredible precision. Tight spaces feel manageable in ways larger conventional trucks struggle with. But then reality begins to catch up with the design, because eliminating the hood also eliminates something else: distance between the driver and impact zones. Modern vehicles rely heavily on crumple zones and structural spacing to absorb collision energy before it reaches occupants. The Ecoline's design leaves very little material between the driver and whatever is directly ahead. Drivers from the era joked darkly that your knees became the bumper, and while exaggerated, the comment reflects a real psychological discomfort many people felt operating these trucks. You are extremely aware of how little exists between you and the outside world. And then there's the engine placement, because to maximize space efficiency, part of the engine intrudes into the cabin area itself. That means heat, noise, and vibration become much more noticeable inside compared to traditional trucks where the engine sits isolated ahead of the firewall. On hot days, the cabin could become extremely warm. One former owner laughed, "The truck heated your legs whether you wanted it to or not." That heat becomes part of the vehicle's personality. You are constantly aware that machinery is operating very close to you. The Ecoline does not isolate the driver from mechanics, it practically introduces them. And then comes the handling. Because the Ford Ecoline pickup combines a tall, boxy shape with a lightweight body and relatively short wheelbase. In calm conditions, it feels manageable enough. But once strong crosswinds arrive, the vehicle begins reacting much more dramatically than traditional pickups. Drivers often compared the sensation to pushing a large, empty object through moving air. One owner famously joked, "It drives like a toaster with commitment issues." And somehow that description is weirdly accurate. The truck doesn't necessarily feel dangerous all the time, it feels nervous. Wind gusts, uneven pavement, and highway turbulence all become part of the conversation between the driver and the machine. You don't simply point it down the road and forget about it, you constantly interact with it. But despite all its awkwardness, discomfort, and unconventional engineering, the Ecoline developed a second life decades later. Hot rodders fell in love with it. And that might sound ridiculous at first until you understand the platform's advantages. The body is lightweight, the proportions are bizarre enough to stand out instantly, and the compact structure can accept surprisingly large V8 engine swaps. Suddenly, what began as an odd little utility truck transforms into something far more aggressive. A machine that looks like a 1960s delivery van but accelerates like a muscle car. That contrast is exactly why enthusiasts adore them today. One custom builder described it perfectly. It looks harmless until it outruns you. And visually, nothing else really compares to it. Modern trucks are massive, aerodynamic, and heavily engineered around safety standards. The Ecoline comes from a completely different design philosophy, one where maximizing interior space and minimizing exterior size mattered more than crash structure or refinement. That makes it feel almost alien today, like a delivery vehicle imagined by science fiction artists who only vaguely understood how dangerous real roads could be. And maybe that's why people still love them, because the Ford Ecoline pickup doesn't feel polished or logical by modern standards. It feels experimental, a strange metal shoebox balancing practicality, danger, and personality all at once, somehow surviving long enough to become one of the most unforgettable weird trucks America ever built. The Subaru Brat may be one of the most hilariously confusing vehicles ever sold in America, because the feature that made it famous wasn't speed, luxury, or even off-road performance. It was the fact that passengers literally sat in plastic seats bolted into the cargo bed, facing backward, out in the open. And somehow, this was completely legal. Built by Subaru during the late 1970s, the Brat already looked unusual before anyone even noticed the seats. The proportions were tiny compared to full-size American pickups, the body looked chunky and playful, and the whole truck resembled a toy somebody enlarged to real dimensions. It sat somewhere between economy car, mini pickup, and off-road machine without fully committing to any category. Then people looked into the bed and saw actual passenger seats staring back at traffic. That's when confusion turned into disbelief. And the reason those seats existed makes the story even stranger. At the time, America placed higher import taxes on compact trucks than on passenger vehicles. Subaru realized that by installing rear-facing seats into the cargo area, the Brat could legally qualify as a passenger vehicle instead of a light truck. So the company essentially solved a government tax problem by turning the truck bed into a bizarre outdoor seating section. One owner joked it's the only pickup where passengers looked more nervous than the driver. And honestly, that reaction makes sense, because riding back there must have felt surreal. Instead of facing forward safely inside a cabin, passengers sat exposed in the open bed, staring directly at the traffic behind them like they were riding a carnival attraction at highway speed. Kids often thought it was the coolest thing ever invented. Parents usually had the opposite reaction. One former passenger remembered it felt fun until a semi-truck pulled up behind you. That perfectly captures the emotional contradiction of the Brat. It looked playful and harmless, but the bed seats also created a strange awareness of how exposed passengers really were. Modern safety standards would never allow something like this today, which is exactly why people still struggle to believe the design was once approved for public roads. But underneath the weirdness, the Subaru Brat was actually surprisingly capable. The lightweight body, combined with Subaru's four-wheel drive system, gave it real traction advantages in snow, mud, and rough terrain. While larger trucks depended on size and power, the Brat relied on agility and balance. It wasn't fast, but it could go places that surprised people. One driver described it perfectly. It climbed hills like a confused little mountain goat. That off-road capability helped build a loyal fan base, especially in rural and snowy regions where small four-wheel drive vehicles made practical sense. Owners discovered that despite the goofy appearance, the Brat was genuinely useful in difficult conditions. And that contrast became its entire personality, because visually it looked almost ridiculous. Tiny proportions, plastic bed seats, chunky styling, a pickup smaller than many modern compact cars. But once roads turned muddy or snowy, the little Subaru suddenly became competent in ways nobody expected. One owner laughed years later. People mocked it until their giant trucks got stuck. That underdog quality is a huge reason the Brat became legendary. It wasn't trying to dominate the road with power or intimidation. It survived through creativity, lightweight engineering, and pure weirdness. Even the name Brat added to the personality. Everything about the vehicle felt playful instead of serious. And yet, somehow, it worked. Of course, survival rates became a problem over time. Many Brats were driven hard in rough climates where rust slowly consumed the bodies and frames. Others were modified, wrecked, or simply worn out from years of off-road use. Because they were inexpensive utility vehicles, few people imagined they would someday become collectible. Now, surviving original examples are highly sought after precisely because nothing remotely similar exists anymore. Modern manufacturers would never risk building something this strange. A compact pickup with outdoor passenger seats designed partly around a tax loophole sounds less like a real product and more like an urban legend. But the Subaru Brat was absolutely real, and that's why people still love it today. Not because it was perfect, not because it was fast, but because it represents a time when car companies occasionally solved problems in the most absurd way imaginable, and somehow created unforgettable machines completely by accident. The Chevrolet Corvette Rampside is one of those vehicles that looks like it was designed during a very specific moment in automotive history when engineers were asking one question above everything else. What if we completely ignore how a truck is supposed to look? Built by Chevrolet in the early 1960s, it was part of the larger Chevrolet Corvair family, which already had a reputation for unusual engineering thanks to its rear-mounted air-cooled engine. But the Rampside took that concept and pushed it into even stranger territory by turning a compact car platform into a pickup truck with one of the most unusual loading systems ever put into production. At first glance, the design is almost disorienting. Instead of a traditional flatbed or step-side configuration, the Rampside features a massive fold-down ramp built into the passenger side of the vehicle. When lowered, it creates a smooth incline directly into the cargo area, allowing motorcycles, small equipment, and heavy loads to be rolled inside without lifting. It is a genuinely clever idea. But visually, it is completely surreal, because that ramp changes everything about the truck's proportions. The side profile becomes asymmetrical, the body looks unusually tall and boxy, and the entire vehicle gives the impression of being engineered around a function rather than a traditional aesthetic. One observer famously described it as a refrigerator that learned how to load itself. And that description is not far off emotionally. The engineering logic behind the Chevrolet Corvette Rampside actually makes sense when you understand the platform. The rear-mounted air-cooled engine eliminates the need for a long front drivetrain, which allows for a completely flat cargo floor. That flat floor was a major advantage for hauling, especially for users who needed to roll heavy objects directly into the bed rather than lift them. So from a pure utility perspective, it was ahead of its time in certain ways. But then you step back and look at the overall silhouette again, and the contradiction becomes obvious. Because practicality and visual balance were not always aligned in this design. The truck sits low, wide, and unusually compact for a utility vehicle, yet the side ramp adds a visual feature that immediately breaks symmetry. It looks engineered, but not refined in the traditional sense. Instead, it feels like a solution built directly onto an existing shape without concern for conventional styling harmony. One owner described it bluntly: "It's not pretty, but it never pretends to be." That honesty is part of its appeal. Driving the ramp side is also a different experience compared to standard pickups of the era. Because the rear engine layout shifts weight distribution toward the back, the driving feel is distinct. It does not behave like a front-heavy truck, and steering response feels different from traditional American pickups of the time. In certain conditions, especially when loaded properly, it feels balanced and stable in ways people did not expect from something that looks so unconventional. But unloaded, the personality changes again, reinforcing the idea that this is a vehicle designed around specific use cases rather than universal behavior. And that is where opinions split sharply. Some drivers saw it as brilliant engineering disguised in strange packaging. Others saw it as unnecessarily complex and visually awkward compared to conventional trucks. One mechanic from the era summarized the debate in a very simple way: you either understand why it exists or you don't. And that's still true today. Because the Chevrolet Corvair ramp side was never designed to be universally appealing. It was designed to solve a very specific loading problem in a very specific engineering context. Everything else, appearance, proportions, even its reputation, came as secondary consequences. Over time, many of these trucks were used in commercial environments where practicality mattered more than preservation. They worked in delivery fleets, small businesses, and utility roles where appearance was irrelevant. As a result, surviving examples are relatively rare today, especially in original condition. Modern enthusiasts now look at it differently. What once seemed awkward and experimental now feels bold and innovative. The idea of a side loading ramp integrated directly into a pickup bed still feels futuristic even decades later. In an era where most trucks rely on rear loading gates, the ramp side's approach stands out as something genuinely different. One collector summed it up perfectly: "It's ugly enough that you remember it forever, and smart enough that you forgive it for being ugly." And that is the essence of the Chevrolet Corvair ramp side. A vehicle that never tried to be traditionally beautiful, never tried to be conventional, but quietly introduced one of the most unusual and clever utility ideas in American truck history, wrapped in a shape that still makes people do a double take more than 60 years later. The Dodge Dude is one of those rare cases in automotive history where the name alone sounds like a joke that somehow made it into production reality. Built by Dodge during the early muscle truck era of the 1970s, it was based on the standard D100 pickup, a completely normal workhorse platform that farmers and tradespeople used for hauling, towing, and daily labor. And then Dodge decided to ruin its seriousness on purpose. The Dude package transformed a plain utility truck into something that looked like it had been designed during a loud weekend at a drag strip. Bright side stripes, oversized decals spelling out Dude in unapologetic lettering, chrome accents, rally-style wheels, and paint combinations that seemed more suited to a show car than a working vehicle. It was not subtle. It was not restrained. It was not trying to blend in with anything. It looked like a pickup that had just discovered personality and immediately turned it up to maximum volume. One dealership employee from the era reportedly said, "It didn't look like a truck you bought. It looked like a truck you dared someone else to buy." And that's the core of its identity. Because in 1970, pickups were still overwhelmingly seen as tools first and lifestyle objects second. The idea of a truck designed to look flashy, humorous, and slightly rebellious was still unusual, so when customers saw the Dodge Dude sitting on a lot, they didn't know how to categorize it. It wasn't quite a serious work vehicle anymore, but it also wasn't a pure performance machine in the traditional sense. It existed in an awkward space between utility and attitude. And then there was the name, Dude. In modern context, it sounds almost ironic, but in the early 1970s, it felt even more unusual. Truck names usually communicated strength, durability, or capability. Words like heavy-duty, super, power, or ranch were common, but dude sounded casual, playful, almost like slang that escaped from a conversation and ended up on a tailgate badge. One buyer joked, "It sounds like something you say, not something you drive." That confusion became part of its charm. But underneath all the graphics and humor was something very serious: real V8 performance. Depending on configuration, buyers could equip the dude with strong engines, including large displacement options that delivered genuine muscle car acceleration characteristics. This meant that despite its playful exterior, the truck could move with surprising authority. And that contrast is what made it unforgettable, because nobody expected a truck that looked like a rolling joke to actually feel fast. One owner famously described the experience at a stoplight. "People are laughing at the decals right up until you leave them behind." That moment of transformation, from comedy to performance, is what gave the dude its personality. The engine didn't care about graphics, it didn't care about branding. It simply delivered torque in a way that could surprise unsuspecting drivers who assumed the truck was all style and no substance. But despite its hidden capability, the market never fully embraced it. Many traditional truck buyers were conservative in their expectations. They wanted function, durability, and familiarity. At the same time, muscle car enthusiasts tended to look toward dedicated performance models rather than pickup trucks. The dude ended up caught between those worlds, too playful for one audience and too unconventional for the other. Dealers sometimes struggled to explain it. Was it a work truck? A street performance truck? A styling package for personality? Even salespeople weren't entirely sure how to pitch it. One former salesman summed it up simply: "If you had to explain it for more than a minute, the customer probably wasn't buying it." As a result, production numbers remained relatively limited, and many examples were used like standard trucks rather than preserved as special editions. They hauled materials, towed trailers, worked construction sites, and endured the same harsh treatment as any other D100. Over time, that practical use led to heavy wear, rust, and attrition, which is why surviving examples today are unexpectedly rare. Not because it was expensive or exotic when new, but because very few people treated it as something worth saving. Now, collectors see it differently. What once looked like a novelty or a marketing experiment now feels like an early attempt at personality-driven pickup design, decades before trucks became lifestyle symbols. The stripes, the humor, the attitude, all of it now reads as a preview of a future where pickups would become expressive rather than purely functional. One collector summed it up perfectly. "It's what happens when a work truck decides it wants to go to a drag race instead of the job site." And that is exactly what makes the Dodge Dude so memorable. Not because it was the most powerful, not because it was the most practical, but because it was one of the first pickups that openly admitted it wanted attention and then backed it up with enough V8 power to deserve it. The Suzuki Mighty Boy is one of those vehicles that looks like it was designed during a very specific moment in Japanese automotive history when engineers were asking a simple question: how small can a pickup truck be before it stops making sense? Built by Suzuki in the early 1980s, it was part of Japan's K-vehicle philosophy. Ultra-compact, tax-efficient machines designed for dense city environments where space is more valuable than size and practicality is measured in centimeters rather than cubic feet. But even by K standards, the Mighty Boy pushes things into surreal territory. At first glance, it looks less like a truck and more like a cartoon interpretation of one. The proportions are so compact that it almost feels like the body was scaled down incorrectly. The cabin is tiny, the stance is narrow, and the rear bed is so short it barely qualifies as cargo space in any traditional sense. One owner described it perfectly. "It looks like a pickup that got shrink-wrapped by accident." And that impression doesn't go away when you look closer, because the cargo bed is the real joke and the real charm at the same time. It exists, technically, but it is so small that everyday hauling becomes more symbolic than practical. A suitcase fits, A grocery bag fits, maybe a very small bicycle if you're optimistic, but anything beyond that immediately reveals the limits of the design. And yet, Suzuki still marketed it as a utility vehicle. That contradiction defines the entire identity of the Suzuki Mighty Boy. Under the hood, things are even more amusing. The engine is tiny even by motorcycle standards, producing modest power that prioritizes efficiency over performance. When pushed hard, it produces a high-pitched mechanical sound that owners often describe as closer to an appliance than a car. One driver famously said, "It doesn't accelerate, it negotiates with gravity." But that lack of power is not really the point, because the Mighty Boy was never meant to compete with full-size pickups or even conventional compact trucks. It was designed for urban micro-mobility, tight streets, short trips, low fuel consumption, and maximum ease of parking. In that environment, its size becomes a superpower rather than a limitation. You can park it almost anywhere. You can maneuver it through spaces that would make larger vehicles give up immediately. And visually, it stands out everywhere it goes, because nothing else on the road looks quite like it. It has the charm of something that shouldn't exist in real life but does anyway, fully functional and road legal. People don't just notice it, they react to it. Confused stares, smiles, double takes. It creates an immediate emotional response because it challenges expectations of what a pickup truck is supposed to be. One owner joked, "You don't drive it to carry things, you drive it to confuse people." That humor became part of its legacy. Inside, the cabin is equally minimalist. Everything is scaled down, simplified, and focused on basic transport rather than luxury or prestige. There is no illusion of luxury or power. It feels honest in a very direct way. You are inside a small machine designed for small tasks, and nothing pretends otherwise. And that honesty is why it has developed such a cult following. Because while many trucks try to look bigger, stronger, or more capable than they are, the Suzuki Mighty Boy does the opposite. It fully embraces its size and turns it into personality. It is not trying to be intimidating, it is trying to be useful in the smallest possible form. Over time, many were simply used up and discarded, because K-cars were never intended to be long-term collectibles in the way classic American vehicles were. Rust, wear, and everyday urban use slowly reduced surviving numbers, especially outside Japan. But today, enthusiasts see it differently. What once looked like a strange micro-utility vehicle now represents a peak moment in Japanese design experimentation, when engineers were willing to push practicality into absurdity just to see what would happen. One collector summed it up perfectly. It's not a pickup pretending to be big, it's a big idea pretending to be a tiny truck. And that is exactly why the Suzuki Mighty Boy is unforgettable. Not because it was powerful, not because it was practical in a traditional sense, but because it proved that even a pickup truck can become adorable, absurd, and strangely brilliant, all at the same time. The Volkswagen Type 2 pickup looks like the result of someone taking a perfectly normal van and making one very simple but very strange decision. Let's cut the back off and see what happens. Built by Volkswagen during the early 1970s, it was part of the larger Type 2 family that had already become a cultural symbol for simplicity, travel, and counterculture life. But in pickup form, it becomes something even more unusual, because instead of the familiar enclosed hippie van silhouette, you get a flat-faced, forward-sitting cab with an exposed cargo bed behind it. The proportions are awkward in the most charming way possible. The front looks like a smiling box, the wheels feel too small for the body, and the entire vehicle sits in a visual category that doesn't quite match anything else on the road. One driver described it perfectly. It looks like a van that forgot it was supposed to be finished. And that feeling continues once you sit inside. The driving position in the Volkswagen Type 2 pickup is extremely forward, with the windshield right in front of you and very little separation between driver and the road. You don't feel like you're sitting inside a van-long vehicle, you feel like you're leading it, almost perched at the very front edge of motion. One owner joked, "You're not driving the truck, you're announcing its arrival." That forward placement gives it excellent visibility in city environments, especially at low speeds, where maneuvering tight streets and narrow delivery routes becomes surprisingly manageable. But the same design that helps in urban settings becomes a challenge on highways and hills. Because performance was never the focus. The rear-mounted engine, shared conceptually with other Volkswagen air-cooled designs, provides enough power for basic hauling and transport, but when the truck is loaded, especially on inclines, acceleration becomes slow and deliberate. Hills are not conquered so much as they are patiently climbed, one mechanical breath at a time. One owner described uphill driving like this: "You don't pass traffic, you become part of it." But that simplicity is also its strength. Mechanics of the era often praised how easy these vehicles were to work on. With minimal electronics, straightforward air-cooled engineering, and accessible components, repairs could be done with basic tools and a bit of improvisation. There is a famous saying among old Volkswagen mechanics: "If you have a screwdriver and patience, you have a workshop." That mechanical honesty made the truck incredibly popular for small businesses. Surf shops, electricians, flower delivery services, and coastal trades all relied on it. It wasn't fast and it wasn't refined, but it was predictable, easy to maintain, and cheap to operate. It became less of a status vehicle and more of a working companion that simply kept showing up every day. But that daily use identity is also why so few survive today, because the Volkswagen Type 2 pickup was never treated like a collectible when it was new. It was used heavily, often in harsh environments, and driven until it could no longer continue. Rust, constant loading, and decades of service slowly erased most examples from existence. What remains today is a small number of survivors that feel almost unreal in modern traffic. Because compared to today's pickups, tall, powerful, heavily engineered, the Volkswagen Type 2 pickup feels like it comes from an entirely different philosophy. It is light, slow, simple, and almost naive in its design approach. One enthusiast summed it up perfectly: "It doesn't feel like a truck trying to be tough, it feels like a truck trying to be helpful." And that is what makes it memorable. Not its speed, not its strength, but its complete honesty. A machine built on simplicity, used until exhaustion, and now remembered as one of the most charmingly strange utility vehicles ever to carry people, tools, and surfboards across an entire generation.